Have you ever noticed that some people seem emotionally exhausted all the time, even when nothing obviously bad is happening in their life? They still go to work. They still answer messages. They still laugh during conversations and say they're fine. From the outside, they look functional, calm, even. But internally, their mind never truly slows down. Every interaction gets replayed later in private. Every shift in someone's tone gets analyzed. Every awkward silence, delayed reply, or strange facial expression gets quietly stored somewhere in the background of their mind. And after years of living this way, they begin asking themselves a question that feels impossible to answer. Why am I so mentally tired all the time? The strange part is, most people around them don't understand it. They assume this exhaustion comes from overreacting, being too emotional, too sensitive, too serious. They say things like, "You think too much," or "You need to relax." But what if the exhaustion isn't caused by weakness at all? What if it's the cost of being deeply aware? Because psychology suggests something important here. Some people are not simply experiencing life emotionally. They are processing life on multiple layers at the same time. While most conversations stay on the surface, their brain is unconsciously scanning for tension, emotional inconsistency, hidden meaning, future consequences, and subtle changes in behavior. Their nervous system is constantly collecting information, trying to predict outcomes before they happen. And over time, that level of awareness becomes exhausting. Not because they're broken, not because they're dramatic, but because their brain learned that paying attention was necessary. Necessary to avoid conflict. Necessary to stay emotionally safe. Necessary to understand people before those people became unpredictable. So, even during moments that are supposed to feel peaceful, their mind remains active, observing, processing, preparing. In this video, we're going to explore the hidden psychology behind why highly self-aware people often feel emotionally drained, disconnected, and mentally overwhelmed, even when their life appears completely normal from the outside. And by the end, you may realize that the people who understand others the most are often the ones silently carrying the heaviest emotional weight themselves. The first layer is something most highly self-aware people don't even realize they're doing. Their brain never truly stops scanning. Even in completely normal situations, part of their mind is constantly observing the emotional atmosphere around them, not consciously all the time, but automatically, quietly, like a background system that never fully shuts down. You might notice this in small, everyday moments. You send a message, and when someone replies with a slightly shorter sentence than usual, your brain immediately starts analyzing it. Did I say something wrong? Are they upset? Did their mood change? Or maybe you reread old conversations late at night, trying to decode the meaning behind certain words, punctuation, pauses, or reactions. Sometimes you replay interactions in your head over and over, thinking about how someone looked at you, the tone they used, or the moment the energy in the room subtly shifted. Most people don't process social information this deeply, but highly self-aware people often do because their nervous system learned that paying close attention was important. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. Hypervigilance happens when the brain becomes highly sensitive to emotional or environmental changes, especially after long periods of stress, unpredictability, or emotional instability. Your mind adapts by constantly scanning for patterns, tension, or possible threats before they fully appear. And over time, this becomes automatic. Even when nothing is wrong, your brain keeps searching anyway. What makes this even more complicated is something called the default mode network. This is the part of the brain associated with self-reflection, memory replay, future prediction, and internal thinking. In highly self-aware people, this system often becomes extremely active, especially during quiet moments. So while other people relax, your mind keeps processing, replaying, predicting, analyzing. Psychologists also refer to this as predictive processing. Your brain is constantly trying to anticipate outcomes before they happen in order to create emotional safety and reduce uncertainty. The problem is, a nervous system designed for constant anticipation rarely experiences true rest. And this is where things become exhausting. Because eventually, you stop feeling like you're simply living life and start feeling like you're mentally managing life every second you exist. The second layer is more emotional and in many ways, even heavier. Highly self-aware people often become deeply attuned to other people's emotional states, not because they're trying to be, but because their brain learned how to read moods before words were ever spoken. They can walk into a room and immediately feel tension in the air. They notice when someone says, "I'm okay," with a voice that sounds slightly off. They sense emotional distance long before anyone admits something is wrong. And over time, this emotional attunement slowly becomes an emotional burden. Because when your nervous system is constantly tuned into other people's feelings, you begin absorbing emotions that were never supposed to belong to you in the first place. This pattern often begins in emotionally unpredictable environments. Maybe growing up, you had to monitor a parent's mood to know whether the house would feel safe that day. Maybe love felt inconsistent. Maybe conflict appeared without warning, so your brain adapted by becoming hyper-aware of emotional changes before they fully happened. Psychologists sometimes call this parentification. This happens when a child unconsciously takes on emotional responsibility that should have belonged to the adults around them. Instead of simply being a child, they become the emotional stabilizer, the peacekeeper, the one who learns to manage tension before it explodes. And the frightening part is, many people carry this role into adulthood without realizing it. They become the stable one in every relationship, the listener, the therapist friend, the emotionally reliable person everyone leans on during difficult moments. But almost nobody asks who carries them. So they spend years absorbing stress in conversations, calming anxious people, fixing emotional problems, and holding space for everyone else while quietly neglecting their own emotional exhaustion. Psychologists refer to this as compassion fatigue. When empathy becomes constant, the nervous system eventually burns out, not because the person stopped caring, but because caring never stopped. Pause for a second and think about how often you carry emotions that were never yours to carry. How many times have you walked away from a conversation feeling emotionally heavy without understanding why? That's the hidden cost of becoming emotionally attuned to everyone around you. You become so skilled at protecting other people's emotional worlds that you slowly forget how to protect your own. The third layer is something many highly self-aware people secretly struggle with every single day: overthinking. But here's where psychology becomes interesting. Most people think overthinking is simply a bad habit, a personality flaw, or a sign that someone is too anxious. But in reality, overthinking is often a form of nervous system protection. Your brain is not trying to torture you. It's trying to protect you from pain before the pain ever arrives. So your mind begins running internal simulations constantly, predicting conversations before they happen, imagining possible outcomes, rehearsing emotional scenarios over and over in an attempt to stay prepared. You might spend 20 minutes preparing for a simple conversation in your head. You replay old arguments and think about what you should have said differently. You imagine worst-case scenarios before making even small decisions. Sometimes you mentally rehearse rejection before texting someone back, just to soften the emotional impact in case things go wrong. And the strange thing is, part of your brain genuinely believes this helps keep you safe. Psychologists sometimes describe this as an anxiety prediction system. Your nervous system becomes highly focused on reducing uncertainty, because uncertainty itself starts feeling emotionally dangerous. This creates something called uncertainty intolerance. For some people, not knowing what will happen feels more stressful than the negative outcome itself. So the brain keeps thinking, planning, analyzing, and preparing because mentally controlling the future feels safer than emotionally facing the unknown. There's also another psychological concept involved here called reward prediction error. This refers to the brain constantly comparing expected outcomes with actual outcomes. Highly self-aware people often run these comparisons non-stop, trying to anticipate emotional disappointment before it happens. The result is a mind that rarely rests. And ironically, intelligence often makes this worse. Because the more mentally perceptive someone becomes, the more possibilities their brain can imagine. More outcomes, more risks, more interpretations, more hidden meanings. In other words, deeper awareness creates more mental noise. Your brain becomes like a room full of tabs left open at the same time. And eventually, even simple decisions become emotionally exhausting because your mind keeps trying to calculate every possible emotional consequence before taking action. But the deeper problem isn't the overthinking itself. It's the fact that somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned that being unprepared was unsafe. The fourth layer is the inability to truly rest. For many highly self-aware people, silence doesn't feel relaxing. It feels uncomfortable, almost threatening. So they keep themselves stimulated constantly, checking their phone every few minutes, playing background noise while working or sleeping, filling every quiet moment with productivity, scrolling, music, or mental activity. And when they finally stop, guilt appears almost immediately. This often comes from trauma-based nervous system conditioning. When the brain spends years in survival mode, it becomes stuck in a state psychologists call hyperarousal, a constant sense of internal alertness. Over time, the brain also becomes dependent on stimulation and dopamine reinforcement, making stillness feel emotionally unnatural. Because for some people, slowing down doesn't feel peaceful, it feels dangerous. Their nervous system learned that staying busy meant staying prepared, and resting started to feel like losing control. The fifth layer is where self-awareness slowly turns into emotional isolation. Because when someone becomes highly skilled at reading patterns in people, they also begin noticing contradictions that most others completely ignore. They notice when someone's words don't match their energy, when kindness feels performative, when a smile looks emotionally disconnected from the eyes behind it. Over time, this pattern recognition becomes almost automatic. You start detecting fake behavior, manipulation, passive resentment, emotional dishonesty, and hidden tension in places where everyone else seems perfectly comfortable. And this creates a very strange experience. You can be surrounded by people and still feel emotionally alone. Because while everyone else is enjoying the surface-level interaction, part of your brain keeps noticing the deeper emotional reality underneath it. The awkward silence nobody acknowledges. The insecurity hidden behind arrogance. The forced laughter covering exhaustion. It's like living in emotional high resolution. You don't just hear words. You hear hesitation. You hear emotional subtext. You notice the tiny inconsistencies most people filter out automatically. At first, this may sound like a gift, but after a while, it becomes emotionally exhausting because it becomes difficult to fully relax around people when your brain is constantly detecting what feels emotionally off. And eventually, superficial interactions start feeling strangely empty. Small talk becomes draining. Fake politeness becomes irritating. Certain social environments begin to feel emotionally artificial, even if everyone else seems comfortable there. This is why many highly self-aware people slowly withdraw inward over time. Not because they hate people, not because they think they're better than others, but because their nervous system struggles to feel safe in emotionally disconnected environments. The painful irony is that these people often understand others extremely deeply while feeling misunderstood themselves almost all the time. They become the observer in every room, the one noticing everything, the one quietly carrying emotional awareness nobody else seems to talk about. And after years of this, loneliness starts becoming less about physical isolation and more about emotional disconnection. The feeling that very few people truly see the world the way you do. And this leads to the most painful part of all. The more deeply you understand human behavior, the harder it sometimes becomes to feel genuinely understood by other people. The sixth layer is one of the most invisible. Highly self-aware people often become emotionally strong so early in life that eventually everyone around them starts depending on them for stability. They become the calm one during conflict, the rational one during emotional chaos, the person others call when life falls apart. And after a while, this role becomes part of their identity. They become the therapist friend, the problem solver, the emotional caretaker who always knows what to say, how to help, how to calm people down, and how to carry emotional weight without making it visible. But what most people never notice is how exhausted this person actually is underneath. Because competence hides suffering very well. Psychologists refer to this as emotional labor, the invisible psychological effort involved in managing emotions, maintaining harmony, supporting others, and regulating emotional environments constantly. And for highly self-aware people, this labor rarely stops. They monitor everyone else's emotional state while quietly suppressing their own. They become so used to being emotionally reliable that eventually they stop expressing their own needs altogether. This is where self-silencing begins. Not because they have nothing to say, but because somewhere deep down, they learned that their role was to hold things together, not fall apart themselves. Attachment dynamics also play a role here. People who grow up becoming emotionally responsible for others often develop relationships where they feel valued mainly for what they provide emotionally, not for who they are underneath all that strength. So they become deeply needed, but deeply unseen. People admire their calmness without realizing how much anxiety exists beneath it. People trust their emotional wisdom while rarely asking how they themselves are coping. And over time, this creates a painful emotional imbalance. The person supporting everyone else slowly becomes emotionally unsupported themselves. You'll often hear these people say things like, "I don't want to burden anyone. I'm used to handling things alone." Or, "It's easier if I just deal with it myself." But the truth is, constantly being emotionally strong for everyone else can become its own form of loneliness. Because eventually, you stop feeling like a person and start feeling like emotional infrastructure for other people's lives. But the strongest people are often the least emotionally supported. The seventh layer is perhaps the hardest one to explain to other people. It's the feeling of being emotionally out of sync with the world around you. Highly self-aware people can still function socially. They can hold conversations, go to work, laugh at jokes, and appear completely normal from the outside. But internally, there's often a quiet sense of separation they can't fully describe. Because while many people move comfortably through surface-level interactions, deeply self-aware individuals tend to crave emotional depth, authenticity, and psychological meaning in almost everything. And after a while, shallow conversations begin to feel strangely exhausting. Talking endlessly about appearances, trends, gossip, or social performance can start feeling emotionally empty. Not because they think they're superior to others, but because their mind naturally searches for something deeper underneath the surface. This is where introspection becomes both a gift and a burden. Highly self-aware people spend enormous amounts of time inside their own mind, reflecting, analyzing, questioning their behavior, emotions, identity, relationships, and purpose. Their brain constantly searches for patterns and meaning, which creates a level of cognitive depth that many people around them may never fully relate to. And eventually, this leads to something psychologists call existential isolation. The realization that no matter how connected you are socially, your inner world can still feel profoundly lonely. Because some experiences are difficult to translate into words, how do you explain constantly thinking about human behavior? How do you explain feeling emotionally overwhelmed by things other people barely notice? How do you explain the exhaustion of carrying self-awareness everywhere you go? This creates a painful emotional paradox. You become very good at understanding everyone else, their fears, their coping mechanisms, their emotional wounds, their hidden insecurities. But at the same time, you quietly feel understood by almost no one. So, you start adapting. You simplify yourself in conversations. You stop explaining certain thoughts because they take too much energy. You learn how to appear emotionally normal, even when your internal world feels incredibly complex. And over time, that loneliness becomes quieter, but deeper. Because the more awareness expands inside a person, the harder it sometimes becomes to feel truly emotionally seen. And this is the hidden cost of awareness nobody talks about. So after everything we've talked about in this video, here's the deeper truth hiding underneath all of it. Emotional exhaustion is not always a sign that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it's the natural consequence of being deeply aware for too long. When your brain constantly analyzes emotions, predicts outcomes, monitors tension, absorbs other people's energy, and searches for hidden meaning beneath everyday interactions, your nervous system rarely gets a chance to fully rest. You are carrying an invisible level of psychological processing that most people around you never even notice. And over time, that awareness becomes heavy. Not because you are weak, not because you are too sensitive, but because your mind learned to survive by paying attention to everything. That sensitivity you criticize in yourself may actually be depth, your emotional awareness, your empathy, your ability to notice subtle shifts in people and environments, your tendency to reflect deeply instead of living only on the surface. None of these traits were created by accident. In many ways, your nervous system adapted itself for survival, perception, and emotional understanding. The problem is that people living in emotionally disconnected environments often misunderstand these traits completely. They call you intense when you're simply aware. They call you distant when you're emotionally overwhelmed. They call you an overthinker when your brain has spent years trying to create safety through understanding. But awareness is not the enemy. The real challenge is learning how to carry awareness without letting it consume your entire life. And healing often begins there. Learning how to rest without guilt. Learning that boundaries are not selfish. Learning that you don't have to emotionally carry everyone around you just because you can. Learning to show yourself the same compassion you constantly give to other people. Most importantly, learning that being emotionally strong does not mean facing everything alone. Because highly self-aware people often become so used to being the safe place for others that they forget they also deserve emotional support, softness, and understanding. And the truth is, awareness can eventually become wisdom instead of burden. The same depth that once exhausted you can become the thing that helps you build meaningful relationships, stronger boundaries, emotional clarity, and a more authentic connection with yourself. The truth is, some minds were never designed to live only on the surface. And you are not weak for feeling deeply in a world that teaches people to disconnect from themselves. If this video resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt emotionally exhausted from constantly thinking, analyzing, or carrying emotional weight that other people couldn't see? And if you enjoy these kinds of videos, exploring psychology, neuroscience, trauma adaptation, emotional intelligence, overthinking, hidden behavioral patterns, and the inner chaos people silently carry every day, make sure to subscribe and support the channel. Your support genuinely helps this channel continue creating more meaningful videos for people trying to better understand themselves and the complicated emotional world they live inside. And before you leave, sit with this question for a moment. If your mind stopped trying to protect everyone and everything for one moment, who would you be underneath all that emotional vigilance? Deep Ravines Lab Protocol. Characters and stories are AI-generated for motivational insights. 2. Content is curated for entertainment and exploring the messiness of human psyche. 3. No proselytizing or harmful content.